The things that will influence the business case for captured carbon, whether it goes to be sequestered or whether it's used, are the economic landscape and the technical abilities. So as we kind of touched on briefly earlier, if you are located next to one of these massive carbon pipelines that's going into existing underground storage, the cost of sequestering your CO2 is likely to be a lot less than if you're located in a more isolated environment with less access to existing infrastructure. So some of these economic drivers are built into the project, but some of them are related to the regulatory environment, which is why I want to touch on some of the most relevant policies and subsidies impacting the evolution of the carbon capture, utilization, sequestration market today. I will warn you, this is a little bit UK and EU focused, just in the interests of time. But if anybody is interested in finding out more about emerging policies in Asia, in New Zealand, Australia, the US, Canada, please do get in touch and I can point you in the right direction. So cap and trade is becoming a big driver of carbon capture. So I've put the EU flag in the middle here because the EU were the original cap and trade with the massively successful EU emissions trading scheme. And so for those of you that aren't familiar, the way that this works is companies in very carbon intensive industries, so refining, cement manufacture, aluminium smelting, were given a cap on the amount of CO2 emissions that they were allowed to emit in any given year. And this cap was based on the best available technology at the time. So the EU put loads of work into this, into finding out what the sort of average emissions for, say, a refinery was. And then they said, okay, well, some of them are way up here and some of them are way down here. We want everybody to be moving down here. And they set these caps. And they said, anybody that exceeds the cap will need to buy EUAs, which are EU allowances, to cover the gap between the cap and what they used. And anybody that uses under the cap will generate these carbon certificates that they can sell. And so these are a formally traded instrument. I think today they were trading at around 85 euros a ton. They've gone as high as 100 euros a ton. And so that creates a business case for companies to invest in carbon reduction technologies. And over time, the caps have lowered and the amount of industries that are included in EU ETS has increased. So aviation has recently been included. And so we're now getting to the point where efficiency technologies are no longer enough to meet the cap. And so companies are starting to invest in carbon capture. And so that cement factory in Germany that we mentioned that's doing carbon capture and sequestration, if their cap's here and they're capturing enough carbon to be here, they've suddenly created a new revenue stream by selling those allowances to competitors that are above their cap. And as the cap goes down over time, that will drive up the price, the value of these credits, creating a business case. And so when the UK left the EU, we retained the scheme. It's called UK ETS, very, very similar. The credits trade at very similar values. And the scheme has inspired others around the world. So New Zealand has its own cap and trade scheme, as does China. Mexico's just trialed one. Canada has one. South Korea has a very effective one. Even Kazakhstan has one. And in the US, although there is no cap and trade scheme at a federal level, California has introduced one, which is driving down the usage of natural gas across the state very successfully. So we touched on this by talking about the tradable instruments, that there are carbon prices that are set by these regulatory schemes. There, in addition to the cap and trade schemes, carbon taxes are being introduced in different regulatory environments. So one that is about to be introduced by the EU, well, it just has been introduced by the EU, is the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And the purpose of CBAM, from the EU's perspective, is to try and create a level playing field. They make the point that EU ETS has driven down emissions from domestic companies, which has incurred costs. And so businesses from around the world are potentially able to compete on price because they are much more carbon intensive, because they haven't had the regulatory pressure to invest in these carbon reduction technologies. And so by introducing this carbon border adjustment mechanism, it acts as a tax on carbon emissions that creates an incentive for businesses outside of the EU to reduce their carbon emissions in order to export to the EU. And so these two policies really are driving the price of carbon. But in addition to that, we also have the price of voluntary offsets. So many companies have signed up to voluntary schemes like Science-Based Targets Initiative, which do allow offsetting for unavoidable emissions in order to make claims that your company is net zero. So there are lots of different kinds of voluntary offsets available in the market. You can buy offsets that correspond to a megawatt hour of clean energy generated. You can buy offsets that correspond to a ton of carbon sequestered either by biological means, so through tree planting is quite a traditional voluntary carbon instrument, or you can invest in sequestering carbon underground. And so as more companies enter the voluntary market, the price of these offsets will increase. There's no common traded market. There is no standard price for these offsets. You can pay as little as $1 a ton to as much as $200 a ton, depending on the technology that your business chooses to invest in. But today, the carbon prices are really driven by the regulatory schemes of cap and trade and carbon taxes. But tomorrow, it could be set by supply and demand, because tomorrow there could be, well, in the next couple of decades, say, there could be such demand for captured carbon for the use of synthetic fuels that CO2 becomes a commodity that's driven by supply and demand, just like oil is today. And then the other side of the coin, as well as the kind of regulatory sticks of taxes and cap and trade schemes, there are government subsidies that have been designed to stimulate emerging industries. So as I'm sure everyone can appreciate, if you're the first cement plant in the world to be investing in carbon capture at scale, that's a risk. If you are an energy from waste plant that's investing in carbon capture that's going to create a parasitic load equal to a third of your output, that's a risk to your business case. So governments around the world have invested in supporting these emerging technologies and de-risking them. So in the UK, for example, over 21.7 billion over 25 years has been allocated to funding the carbon capture and sequestration scheme. So the idea of that is it will be similar to the existing contract for difference scheme that we see in the renewable energy space, where rather than companies that are investing in these technologies having to take on market risk for the price of their captured CO2, the government is saying, we will pay you a fixed price. If the market goes up and you sell it for higher than the fixed price, you will give some money to us. But if the market goes down and you sell it for less than the fixed price, the government will give money to the producer. And that's incredibly powerful. That really de-risks projects. That makes it much easier when these projects go to investors, to these large infrastructure funds and banks asking for money. It makes their cash flow a lot more certain, makes it more bankable, means that the technology gets built, because most businesses do not have a spare couple of billion sitting around to spend on investing in carbon capture and R&D as much as they might want to. And so they need to seek external finance, which is where these contract for difference schemes really come in. And then sort of on the more emerging technology side, the EU has got its EU Horizon Innovation Funds, which is just straight up grant funding, often designed to promote academic and industrial partnership. And then we have Refuel EU and the UK SAF mandate, which is two pieces of legislation designed to ensure that the airline industry buys sustainable aviation fuel. And so it creates a market. And Refuel EU in particular requires that SAF producers use biogenic CO2, which is why I think this is a term that anybody in the carbon capture and utilization space is going to start to become more and more familiar with over the next 10 years or so, because there will be this policy. Refuel EU will drive demand for biogenic CO2. So CO2 from David's anaerobic digestion reactors will suddenly be much more in demand than CO2 from, say, a blue hydrogen solution for these synthetic fuels, which again might push businesses such as David's that are investing in carbon capture technology to sell to businesses that are in the utilization space rather than sequestration, depending on the kind of price differential. And that price differential is not just the price that the customer pays, but it's also the cost of getting it to the customer. So as with any of these business cases, lots of different factors, all quite complex.